Greetings. On behalf of the 18 denominations that make up the North Carolina Council of Churches, I'm Susanna Tuttle, Director of the Council's Eco-Justice Connection initiatives and staff representative to the Council's Legislative Committee for our governing board. It is in prayer that I welcome everyone to Day 5, our final day of the 2022 Critical Issues Seminar, The Ties That Bind Democracy. Some have said the foundation of democracy is built on the foundation of God's divine act of creating humans in God's image, Imago Dei. This divine act ensures the uniqueness and value of every single person. By extension, democracies pronounce that every person's voice matters to create the social fabric needed for democracy to flourish. The ties that bind us together as a democracy require vigilance in order to remain strong. This week of learning and engaging with democracy leaders, visionaries, activists, and faith leaders has been full of emotion and power, especially considering the pain communities are experiencing across this country and around the world. Hearing from the Carter Center on the work of maintaining confidence in the integrity of our elections, from the Southern Coalition for Social Justice about why redistricting matters, the North Carolina Voters for Clean Elections on how our courts impact our daily lives, the North Carolina Black Alliance about challenges of voter suppression, and today we will hear from Blueprint North Carolina on grassroots activism as pro-democracy tool and how to organize effective coalitions in defense of voting rights. All of this week's presentations have been profoundly impactful as we do our shared work to educate, inspire, and mobilize people of faith and conscience to commit to building a more just and equitable future for all. Every session this week has been recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel so that you can continue to review the material with your congregations, families, colleagues, and communities. Today, our featured speaker is Stacey Sebring, Executive Director of Blueprint North Carolina, a progressive ecosystem of nearly 60 formal partner organizations and an expanding web of network allies committed to building independent power for an anti-racist, inclusive democracy. Serena will be sharing about the very important work that she helps to lead, but first it is my honor to share a few things about her leadership. Stacey Sebring, Executive Director, is a queer Black feminist, mother, organizer, and educator. Serena supports the power building strategies of Blueprint North Carolina's partner organizations to demand a more inclusive democracy for North Carolina. She brings leadership and vision to the coalition by strengthening relationships and strategic alignment of partners and coordinating resources and staff capacity in their service. Serena joined the Blueprint North Carolina team in 2020 and more than 10 years of experience in building power, community organizing, policy campaigns, and base building. Previously, she served as regional organizing lead for Southerners on New Ground, SONG. Serena received her BA in sociology from the University of Colorado at Boulder in 2005, her MA in sociology from Duke University in 2008, and her PhD in sociology from Duke University in 2012. Since 2005, she has woven and nurtured relationships across the state with organizers, artists, policymakers, workers, parents, and caregivers on front porches, in church basements, city council rooms, and the State House, and in the streets. Serena, North Carolina Council of Churches is a proud member of Blueprint North Carolina, and it is an honor to host you as the organization's executive director today. We appreciate all that you do for North Carolina and for the preservation of democracy. Welcome.
Wow, thank you so much. It is an honor to be here this Friday afternoon. Thank you, Susanna, and to the Council of Churches for your partnership in our coalition, for this invitation to share my observations and learning, some of them here today. And actually, thanks to Executive Director Jennifer Copeland for schlepping my kid to soccer practice about a decade ago in a carpool where we first met. It is my honor to be here, and I do so in a heavy heart in this week. And so I'd like to just ground in a moment of breath for Uvalde, for Los Angeles, and for Buffalo. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm just going to breathe and hope that you do too. Thank you. Thank you. What a blessing it is to take breath today and to do so in time with you. My name is Stacey Sebring. I use she and her pronouns. It's been my honor to lead Blueprint North Carolina for the last 2 years, or only since the world has been on fire is another way I talk about it. We walk in a long, long legacy of folks doing brave and courageous work in the interest of voting rights and racial equity here in the South. Blueprint was formed in 2007 in order to do large-scale civic engagement coordination. And at that point, it was a body of about 7 organizations that came together to coordinate voter registration efforts. As Susanna shared, we're now a body of over 60 organizations and growing, and our understanding of what our role in holding democracy in this state has also expanded. In the last 10 years, we have grown to really focus on how do we create both greater democracy and more equity at the same time, because it turns out they're the same thing. They're the same thing. And so we now organize a table that does do still the voter registration at scale. This year, Blueprint Partners will collect over 200,000 voter registration cards. And they will do so in coordination with each other and with the support of a new statewide election protection coordination table, because we know that this is a time when we need even greater coordination to protect the very integrity of the system that we serve. So it has been a challenging time, not just for voting, but for sustaining the work of our partners through the pandemic, and particularly through the increasing rise of the threat of political violence, and specifically that coming from white supremacist and far-right organizing. And so very attentively to that, we began to think about what we could offer in the 2020 election cycle. Blueprint for some time has hosted parties at the polls, which has been a very successful endeavor, increasing turnout and I think enjoyment at the polls with DJs and sometimes costumes on Halloween, et cetera, for some years. But in 2020, as we faced questions about how could we do exactly what we had done to bring people out to the polls safely in light of COVID, in light of what we were told was a lack of capacity at our local boards of election to meet the needs for even PPE, or that those kinds of safety precautions were threatened by people who were showing up unmasked and doing things like aggressively coughing on those that they opposed in these debates. It was unprecedented. And I am so grateful that we were able to transform what had been a celebratory parties at the polls into a strategy for developing the capacity for community-based safety that met the moment in 2020 and that we're continuing to build on. So that's really what I want to talk to you about today. I think that there is much we could say about safety in this week. I think that we understand how very unsafe a moment we move in a new way. I've heard from parents struggling to drop off children at school this week that I work with. And as a parent, I wonder how do we pass on this condition to our young people without elected bodies that will make the changes that are necessary to increase their safety. And thankfully, we have some precedent in how to face times like this. I sit each day across from a poster in my office that holds the words of Septima Clark, a civil rights organizer and leader in the South, who is a big part of the legacy that we move in. And Septima Clark writes, "I have great belief in the fact that whenever there is chaos, it creates wonderful thinking. I consider chaos a gift." I'll read it again. "I have great belief in the fact that whenever there is chaos, it creates wonderful thinking. I consider chaos a gift." This is not intuitive. This is not intuitive. And yet I believe it is true. I believe it lines up with what I understand about what happens in moments of chaos, that we are called to our best thinking, that we are called back to relationships, and that we are called to innovation. And I think that this is a time just like that. And so I want to share some of what I think the great thinking of the people of North Carolina has looked like in the face of these threats. 2 years ago, when we were forming this power protection and encouragement program, that's what we came to call it. We knew we needed PPE, so we brought the people's PEE, power, protection, and encouragement, to the polls. We knew that we were seeing folks show up in paramilitary gear downtown Raleigh. We were seeing the weapons of war worn on the steps of our governing institutions. And we were seeing, unfortunately, a growing connection between those extremist ideas and the governance of our communities at every level. We began to think about, what would we do if no one was coming to save us? What would we do if no one was coming to save us? Well, we would need more of us. So we increased the safety of our programs by adding a component of a safety team to each party. This is a simple addition, but what it meant was that we had bodies of 10 people each who are trained in de-escalation, in situational awareness, and in how to coordinate collective decision-making for the sake of safety in crisis moments. So this was a huge benefit, both on election day and after. And we weren't sure if our partners would show up. In fact, what we were asking for in this scary moment was for people to say, yes, I will come out to the polls, which might not be safe. And I will do what I can to make members of my community more safe so that they can share their voice as we make decisions that will hopefully change the conditions that left us so unsafe in that moment. It was an ask for courage. It was an ask to face the unpredictable. And we were so thrilled when so many people and partners said yes. While Blueprint had held maybe 200 or so events during early voting and on election day of the parties at the polls type, when we asked people to create safe sites together, people said yes to the nth degree. They said yes in 70 counties. They said yes by 90 organizations. And they said yes to hosting 750 events across our state over early voting and on election day in 2020. This was surprising and inspiring to see. When I say that people brought power, protection, and encouragement out to the polls, what that looked like often was carrying an extra folding chair to what we expected would be very long lines, so that the person behind them could sit and wait the hours-long time that it might take to get inside. It meant that people brought their barbecue grills out under the assumption that it's much more difficult to be angry with a chicken wing in your hand. And this turned out to be true. In a year that we were expecting violence at the polls, unfortunately, we were expecting violence at the polls. We were very relieved to see that actually we saw very little of that. I wish I could say none of that. Where we did see violence at the polls in Alamance County on the last day of early voting, it was actually an act of the sheriff's department in that county. It was not actually one of the risks that we had prepared for. We had not prepared for violence coming from those who were expected to be there to keep us safe. And in fact, that threat remains, and if anything, has grown over the last year or 2 years, when we've seen in a time of insurrection, our elected officials actually participating in violence, not only against community members, but also against our system of democracy. And what is left as what stands for democracy, or show me what democracy looks like, is the image that I hold of the people who carried the chairs out so that their neighbors could vote. What democracy looks like in 2020 is the people who said, yes, I don't know what's coming, but when they show up with weapons of war and machine guns at the polls, which they did, I won't leave. I will stay. I will stay and I will stand, and I will honor the courage of every other person that chose to do the same, and the necessity that all our voices are included in the decisions that matter. So I am unusually hopeful, actually, about the state of democracy in this time. There's a lot of hand-wringing about it right now, because we're wondering if certain people will make certain decisions that honor what may or may not have been an anti-racist and inclusive democracy to begin with. But what I saw was evidence of faith, was evidence of courage, and was evidence of an understanding about the necessity of community in this time in 2020. And I have faith that those will show up again this year. And boy, do they need to. Boy, do they need to. I want to fast forward just a little bit to what we understand is the possibility if each iteration of an election, if every 2 years, we might call out more people to exercise faith and courage in the interest of community safety, because the accumulation of those looks like a world that we might actually want. When I think about the big vision and the big goal, in which I understand there to be no liberation in isolation, then we come with a collective dream of freedom. We come to seek a world where people live in right relationship with each other through a set of shared agreements and supportive structures. We dream a world where all people live in conditions of collective thriving, of recognizing our essential interdependence, and that each of us, every single one of us, is supported to take our rightful place in caring for this we. It is in this right relationship that we can make righteous and just decisions through practices of democratic decision-making, where each of us informs the conditions of the whole, where each of us is welcomed into that decision-making process, knowing that when this happens, our collective best interest will be done. In this state, we can be made whole from harmful legacies of white supremacy, of capitalism, of nationalism, of heteropatriarchy. It is in collective that we can cure these. That is the only way. We know that sometimes this practice of democracy I'm describing is hard to fathom because we haven't seen it yet. What we've experienced is an exclusive form of democracy. What we've experienced is a brutal form of democracy, which has required blood sacrifice for its spreading. We know that democracy, but there is another kind. And what it will take to get there is a vision. And I'm honored to talk to the North Carolina Council of Churches today, because I think mostly we know this vision best only through our practice of faith, whatever that is, that we understand that democracy looks like Ubuntu, that democracy requires us to be I am because we are, that the best way we might know what this democracy might feel like is where one or more are gathered in his name, or as it is above, so shall it be below. Those are the ways that we know democracy now. We understand it in even a broader set of faith traditions. We know it as namaste, as the God in you, as the God in me recognizes the God in you, and as beloved community. In right relationship, we will make this democracy true.
Oh my goodness, indeed. That image, Serena, that you shared of this is what democracy looks like is the carrying of a chair and to be living in rightful relationship day in and day out, that this isn't something that we necessarily, have to cram into a couple of months during an election cycle, right? That to exactly to your point of the building of beloved community is each step that we take, every breath that we breathe, and how we do that together. I'm hoping folks that have joined us, please use the chat feature to ask any questions that you have. This is a real opportunity to be in a deep dialogue with someone who is certainly a mentor of mine, Serena, and the work that you do, and learning more and more about the role that the North Carolina Council of Churches can and should be playing in right relationship with all of the partner organizations of Blueprint North Carolina. Can you say, I took a little bit of a note, but the PPE, power, protection, what was the E?
Yes, encouragement.
Encouragement, of course.
Encouragement. And this is great because it reminds me of an invitation I'd like to just foreground for you. So power, protection, and encouragement is a program where Blueprint offered support to organizations to hold down a polling place and to do so for one day, to bring out music or entertainment, refreshments, and also to train in de-escalation and situational awareness. That invitation is going to be extended again for this year's election period. We'll be sending those out in July, those invitations. And we really want to welcome the participation of communities of faith. So many of our polling places are actually in houses of faith. And so there is a particular role that churches could play in practicing some of these very necessary de-escalation, situational awareness, as well as invitation, an invitation to right relationship, an invitation to practice democracy together. And I hope you all will join us as well.
Thank you. When you were speaking to that about the de-escalation training, I know that that's something that we've been talking a lot about as staff of the North Carolina Council of Churches, but obviously through our member denominations. And to your point, on one of the Blueprint NC calls that I participated in, we were talking about polling locations specifically, and what it's like to remember that to go into buildings or spaces where folks have not necessarily stepped foot in before. And then so that it's not just that, the fear of there being some sort of tension around the elections, but to just walk into a new building, walk into a church. I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, so many of our member denominations have big signs, big banners, rainbow flags hanging saying all are welcome. But you can't just put up a sign. You have to show that and be that. And I love the power, protection, encouragement, the party at the polls. One of my favorite mantras is party with a purpose.
Yes.
You know, let's do this.
Yes.
So
it
I'm
can
looking
be fun. It also can be fun.
Exactly.
And we can make a choice that it can be fun.
And
I think we should every
voting
time.
is a joy. I put that sticker on with, I wear it all day. Many of us do, and then I save them like on a bulletin board. That should be something that that encouragement piece. So
I do too. Actually, what you just said, I want to note how very important that act could be in this moment in our state. We just witnessed some very hateful legislation come forward. And as a queer person who knows many, many queer folks who feel alienated or isolated from their faith because of homophobia or because of transphobia, I do think that this is another critical opportunity to reach out and to invite members of LGBTQ community into houses of faith, even if it's only because we recognize the right relationship that happens when our community votes together. That alone is a reconciliation that makes a difference. We also move in a time when we see the efforts by folks who have questionable faith to really separate Black community and Black churches from LGBTQ community. And we feel like every time we get to make collective decisions, we have an opportunity to change that. But also every time we gather to protect those elections, we also send a message about the kind of communities that we value and want to create for ourselves, our families, and our communities.
That is just beautiful. And every moment is an opportunity to worship and be that which we seek. So I love that. We have some questions in the chat that I'm going to go to. So one question is, can small interfaith groups connect with Blueprint by connecting online?
So the best way to connect with Blueprint right now, if you're on this call or watching this video, is to email me, serena@blueprintnc.org. And we are working on our website, folks. So we do hope that within the next month or so, there'll be a portal for folks to say, yes, I'd like to hold a power protection and encouragement safe site. But for now, if you're watching and you just want to get more information on us or on the program, please contact me directly.
That's great. And I know how email is as well. I can only imagine how much email you receive, Serena, as the executive director of Blueprint NC. So also please reach out to any of us at the Council of Churches, because I think through our network, we want to be in alignment and know what individuals, communities of faith, interfaith groups would be really fantastic. And then we can communicate on that larger scale. And one of my favorite parts about working with the North Carolina Council of Churches is if you have a Unitarian church over here and we're connected to the Unitarian Church in Greensboro, that's the same with the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians and the Baptist. And, we want everybody, as a statewide organization to become more familiar and not have to reinvent the wheel, and how then we can become trainers of the trainers through our member denominations. So that's really exciting. Thank you for that question. Mary Jane Selgrad asked, how would you prepare next time for the situation you encountered in Alamance County? That's a great question.
Thank you, Mary Jane. This is a great question. I think the work to prepare for that really began even as it was happening. So one of the things that we did to make sure that we were covering polling places where we expected there might be a higher risk of political violence in 2020 was we started tracking, where are places that we had seen voter suppression previously, that we might see an escalation. And, I think one thing I just want to stop here and mention is that I think that there's a lack of awareness of for some of us from the more urban areas of our state,
Mm.
about the conditions of what democracy actually looks like in our rural communities, specifically in rural communities of Eastern North Carolina, or primarily Black rural communities out there. Because what I'm learning from this coalition work is some of the experiences of our more distant neighbors in northeastern North Carolina, where as recently as 2018, we saw coffins brought out to polling places in Black communities as a way to scare people away from voting, or that folks shared pictures of a flatbed truck driving with nooses with mannequins dangling from it as recently as 2018. These kinds of racial terror are not past. They are not past. And that's why I say we'd have to imagine a new democracy that actually was inclusive, because the one that so many of us experience is vastly different from this ideal. So that I just wanted to call folks' attention. I want to say that again and again, because it does not look like it looks in Durham and Raleigh and Charlotte everywhere. So we started tracking incidents like that, like those I just described, and others where we saw the growth of Oath Keepers at the time. This is what we were tracking. And we started creating a spreadsheet of these incidents county by county. And that spreadsheet grew very scary and large very quickly. And we used it to make a distinction of what were the 25 counties of highest concern. This was a rough metric in 2020. And so since then, what we have done is to create a research program. We needed to understand better what were the predictors, what were the places that we might see political violence or voter suppression that created a lack of safety in elections to come. We built out a community collective of partners that included an intersectional grouping of Blueprint folks who are touched by this kind of violence. So when we talk about the dangers of voter suppression created by the far right and by extremist organizing, these are the same forces, the very same people that were opposing masks in 2020, right, that are threatening abortion providers today, that are challenging the schools for their safety. And when we think about gun violence, this is something, this issue that we're thinking very much about this week is another point at which the those who oppose safety, democracy, and our ability to practice those connect. And so we must connect too. And this research group has grown. We were very grateful to be able to bring on a full-time anti-racist research coordinator who now tracks incidents and threats, including those posed by the alignment of sheriffs and other elected officials with these groups, with these paramilitary groups. We know that, that it's very important we learn the lesson of Alamance County as a group that wants to predict and therefore prevent racial terror. We want to understand better where it comes from those who are supposed to protect us, and to expose those, let our partners know, and to really think about what does community-led safety look like. And we can't say exactly what that is sitting in Durham and in Raleigh, but we can support local organizations to answer these questions. So in order to prepare for another situation like the one that we saw in Alamance, we've really been deepening our research muscle, as well as our connections to our partner organizations in places ahead of time where we might see incidents like that, to have conversations about community safety. We're doing a set of re-grants to community partners who are in places like Pasquotank County and Elizabeth City, where we've also seen state violence, about, what would they do to create more safety? And their answers are myriad. There's a church in Elizabeth City that's really sponsoring its congregants' self-defense training. There's another organization there that is hosting a series of healing nights for Black community members to come and share about what is the trauma that they have experienced, and to be part of collectively solving that trauma, to not leave people alone, because we understand breaking isolation as the first and most important step away from the kind of danger and safety, lack of safety that we've seen.
Thank you for that answer. And I'm going to get to these other questions, but I just wanted to comment as someone who lives, so I live out in rural Orange County. We sometimes are calling it the AOC, the Alamance Orange Chatham rural buffer area. It's beautiful, beautiful place. But you're really inspiring me to understand my relationship to what it's like to live at the end of a gravel road. And for me to be able to drive in as a white privileged person and go into the senior center in Chapel Hill and vote, and it's all feels very safe. And it was, but if I didn't do early voting, for example, I vote in a very rural place on the day of the election. And my husband and I have gone out there, and it's a totally different experience. So I'm grateful for the early voting sites because it allows me to go into town. But I don't know as many people when I go to my rural actual precinct district, in a firehouse. And I kind of just want to get in and out of there. And part of it is because, you don't drive down every gravel road in the area that you live on for the very reason of safety issues. So what am I doing, not just again on election day, to build that beloved community of where I live in on the land that I protect and love so much? How am I building those relationships every day so that when I go to my rural voting site, I'm like, hey, it feels like a party, right? So this is really inspiring how you're helping me better understand my relationship to my own community. Linda Dallas asked, will the North Carolina Council of Churches put together a resource list of all the wonderful organizations that have presented this week? Yes, Linda, absolutely. As I was mentioning to all of the speakers as we come on, because ordinarily this is a full day conference and we're together, in spaces, and back in the day of tabling, you'd be picking up a ton of materials and people would go home with a full bag of resources. Good thing that we're not doing that for paper reasons anymore, but the idea of being able to have an ongoing set of evergreen resources, that's why we're recording these. And I do encourage, for folks that weren't able to be on all the other 4 sessions, I've learned so much this week that I'm going to have some time, that I need to just really sit with the materials and each of the presentations, watch the information again, but then also begin to navigate where I see myself personally and professionally moving forward. So as each of us are doing that, I think staying in community, as we're talking about building those relationships with folks that were able to register and participate, and figuring out some strategies. How do we want to fit in? I know that then someone else asked about groups who provide de-escalation training. I would imagine, like myself, that many of us on this call right now want to go somewhere and sign up to be trained. So how I know you said invitations are going to come out in July, and we'll make sure that our network is familiar with that. Are those going to be are they going to be on, can't really do it online? What do you see those trainings looking like?
We do. So yes, we can, even ahead of that, I can share after this call a list of organizations that do de-escalation trainings for you to share with participants. But and then we will offer de-escalation and situational awareness training as part of the power protection and encouragement program. So any organization that partners with us in that program will receive, and in 2020 we did it online. We did it through Zoom. The initial kind of training was 3 sessions with videos that folks could share. And then the structure of the safety teams really is important, because at the heart of effective de-escalation is this collective decision-making from the team in real time. So the most effective training is one that can be followed up by a real conversation in person with your safety team about, you know, who is doing what, around what each person's role is, and developing out a set of protocols. And I'll say, I think that this is important. Again, I think this is important for elections, but I also think in the political climate that we move in today, that we need more bodies of people, and they don't even have to be formally recognized, but we need more neighborhoods to have phone trees, to do basic kinds of collective safety practices, the things that we're learning actually have worked to keep our communities safe for generations, which include presence in each other's lives, porch sitting, you know, the kinds of connection that you just mentioned, Susanna, throughout the year will benefit, as will the organizational structure, the infrastructure that practicing safety together holds. So even after Election Day, we want 100 safety teams across the state. We want people to know that when or if the worst happens in their communities, this body can be called on back into action with its de-escalation training and ways of making decisions together.
That is beautiful. You're making me think, you know, many of us are on Nextdoor app. This has been a way in which to build communities. We do a lot of snake identification on ours in our neighborhood. But what would it even look like? You know, what will it look like when I put on Nextdoor app that I am going to engage in de-escalation training and would like to build partnerships with my neighbors and invite them into that, and you know, to engage, so that yeah, it's you're right. It has to be by the people, for the people. We need to understand sort of the foundational structure of what de-escalation means, but it's going to be up to us to enact it, and it will look different in different places and what role we play. And I do a lot of, you know, most of us probably on this call do a lot of activism and find myself in public spaces in the public square. And we've talked a lot about what it means to have, certainly as faith leaders, chaplains that are ready, you know, to be there, even when things are going well, just to be able to check in, find out, you know, are there some, you know, micro tensions going on that folks aren't aware of? What is it like, you know, to always be sort of spoken at versus have the ability to hear your own voice? And so there's just, that is the democracy that we envision, right?
That is the democracy. That is the democracy. And I think, you know, this practice of collective safety also, I think, is a challenge sometimes, you know, like it is a new technology, an old technology, you know, it is the critical kinds of interconnection. We turn to each other because our safety depends on it. And we're taught in our culture that when something unsafe happens, that we should pick up the phone and call the police. And so I think about back to Alamance County, you know, not every sheriff is the Alamance County sheriff. Let me say that. Not every, but if we're going to be ready to protect each other, then we also have to be able to be the ones that we've been waiting for. And so what that means is it's all of us. It's not we're going to pick up the phone and somebody's going to come and make us safer. It's we're going to pick up the phone and call our neighbor and figure out how we can be safer together. That is where real safety and actually real democracy comes from. And so I think the question of who keeps us safe is also really important. When we imagine we can pick up the phone and help will come and fix it, we because of the cultures we're steeped in, imagine this as a very patriarchal or paternalistic act. but really it's our aunties and our grandmas and our moms, and folks around us every day who have kept us safe. It is the work of people of all kinds of bodies, of all kinds of abilities, that keeps us safe every day. And so honoring that as we think about who we invite into safety teams is also a way of really reshuffling who matters in the kind of decision making about community safety. If we know that I will be safer because my neighbor sits on her porch in the afternoons when the children are coming home after school, like, let's tell that as part of the story of public safety. And let's tell that as the story of democracy as well.
Mm. You're also making me think of just even what kind of energies and powers we bring when we enter into a grocery store, for example. If we are to truly, for those of us at the Council of Churches, to walk as Jesus would, what would it feel like to have Jesus walk into that grocery store? And what kind of energies and positioning of peace and leadership and strength and power does that look like? And to then bring that to folks. This is a really great question, hard to answer, one that I think about quite a bit. What can be done to address faith-based congregations that support the anti-democracy movement?
Whew. I mean, I feel like this might not be the best question for me to answer. I will say this. I think that there's for 501c3s, as many churches are, there's a lot of pressure in this election cycle in particular towards neutrality. And I'm imagining that has a particular pull on faith leaders who are called to protect 501c3s. I'm just an executive director called on to protect a 501c3, but what I hear is we should be neutral to be safe, that we should, in our messaging, even more than typically in this election cycle, that we should shy away from even being perceived to be partisan in any way. And the way that we might be perceived to be partisan seems to have shifted, like the goalposts seem to have shifted. Yeah. I was told not to talk about anti-racism in one of our grant reports. I was told we shouldn't talk about that because anti-racism might be considered partisan. And as a 501c3, we have to stay nonpartisan. And I think it's clear to all of us that the only reason anti-racism would become a partisan issue is not because of the work that 501c3s are doing, but because the work is being redefined by those on the right who are trying to turn the efforts to end racism into a partisan issue, when of course it's not. I think neither party would say we're the party of racism. So the boundaries, I think, of what is called for on us is to get comfortable with the idea that the terrain has shifted, and yet our missions have not. And so if we are to do our jobs, we will need to talk about things like anti-racism. We will need to say, we are not called on to be neutral. And I think that probably applies to houses of faith as much as it does to nonprofits in this season. The idea that if we play by the rules, then the other side would too. Side, whatever the other side is, that we would all be playing by the same rules doesn't work with recent history.
That's exactly right. And certainly the role of the white church, right? And what Jennifer Roberts, the former mayor of Charlotte, and Judge Orr, who was on Monday and are working with the Carter Center to build the dialogue, there was a specific call out to those of us that identify as a predominantly white congregation to be doing these very, very tough conversations that we tend to, in the progressive white church, want to we'll be the first people to say, oh, we're nonpartisan. We're not going to talk about this because I don't know why. Although I feel like that there is a great monumental shift in that. Part of that has been of what has happened within the progressive church of opening up our eyes to what it means to be faithful and devout to God, and that is based in love. And so if we lead with love, we advocate with compassion, I think identifying to that very question of, we got to learn who these churches are. They can't just be the churches that we don't go to, or, don't know anybody, or maybe have, a relative that we argue with on Facebook about, but not really ever get down to the nitty gritty of what's happening in these congregations where potentially they are being very anti-democracy and very racist, and a very overtly open about that. But because people like us are not in those spaces, how are we contrasting that? And so I think that's a big part of our work moving forward with our white denominations and predominantly white churches. I love, there's a lot of questions coming in that say, this is really making me think about who is my neighbor. That's what's coming up for me as well. And Jennifer, do you want to jump in here? We're kind of wrapping up, but I'd like to see the executive director of the Council of Churches and the executive director of Blueprint, and see if you're willing and able to come in and make your point that you put into the chat of. There you are. Great.
I am. Yeah, I'm listening. I do think we need to ground, we in the church need to ground our conversation in scripture and tradition, and then we are less likely to be accused of partisan views. But we've been talking about gun violence here today and really all week, for good reason. That's a highly charged issue. But when I talk about gun violence, I talk about juxtaposition between the Second Amendment and the Second Commandment. And the Second Commandment says, don't have idols. So when we make guns the idol of safety, then we're actually violating God's precepts to have no idols. Now, it takes a little bit of deconstruction to help people understand that they've made their guns more important than their faith in God. But you think about it, and maybe the folks that we've mentioned in our chat line would not be open to that conversation. I know there are a lot of, I know some pastors who actually carry a gun into the pulpit with them because they say they have the best shot from up there. They can see everything. So if somebody comes into the church bent on doing harm, that pastor, preacher actually believes that he can take out that person. Now, I'm not going to that church because I don't want to take a chance on the pastor missing and hitting me instead of his target, because we know that trained law enforcement officials also miss their target. They hit their target less than 50% of the time. So, just think about that, friends. Like, what's the chance of the preacher hitting somebody at the back of the sanctuary that he's aiming for? So all of these things are just mind-boggling to me. But what we try to do at the council is frame these issues through the lens of faith. So if we're going to talk about partisan issues, we're going to find scriptural warrant for what we need to talk about. And in fact, I like to say, we don't really pick the issues. The issues pick us. The issues were picked thousands of years ago when the prophets wrote their words for justice and cried out in the streets of Jerusalem. The issues were picked 2,000 years ago when Jesus walked through the streets of his hometown and told people what to care about and showed people how to love one another. And those are the issues that we continue to promote at the council. It just so happens that some of those justice issues can get framed as partisan issues by politicians.
Well, thank you for that. And Serena, I want to give you a chance to give us some closing before we do our litany. And this has been really eye-opening. And the way that, just want to comment again, the way that you lead with love, I can feel it. Like, this is tough stuff that makes me want to just start bawling. And yet I just really want to like go to a party with you at the same time, at the polls. So it's profoundly inspiring. And I just want to thank you for that. So give you a chance to say some last words before we close out.
Thank you so much. I would love to have a party as soon as we won't all get COVID, and you will be invited. And if not, then I'll see you at the polls with a mask on, and maybe a chicken wing, and it will be fun. I am just grateful for another opportunity to share about this work, and to think about faith and courage, and what it has to do with democracy and the invitations that we offer as organizers and as community members to each other. I really, really do believe that we're on the right path, that we are joined by many others in believing that we can have an anti-racist and inclusive democracy. And I'm also very clear that we are the ones we've been waiting for. And so thank you for joining that band of angels.
Well, thank you to all who participated. You're getting wonderful accolades in the chat here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Profoundly inspiring. Thank you for the work you are doing. So let us close out this week with the same litany that we have closed out with each day. This has been an incredible journey that we are on together. Again, all of these incredible presentations will be distributed, resource packets, invitations to participate in trainings, and we look forward to continuing to build the beloved community together. So please read with your mute on the bold pieces of this closing, and we'll join and hear our voices in our homes together. God of all the ages, who has seen every nation rise and many nations fall, endow in us the wisdom necessary to be a nation that rises to your call for justice and peace. God of all truth, who sees all eternity in the blink of an eye, bestow upon us the humility to listen to those who differ from us so that we might know your truth. God of all people, who has marked each of us as holy by creating each of us in your image, impart to us the courage to create a society where each of us can flourish to the fullness of our ability. May you go in peace, work for justice, and together we will win. I believe it. Amen. We'll be in touch. Take care, all.